we'll talk here for a little bit. But before we do, Phil just gave me this. This is so cool. I just have to share it with you. Sometimes when we start and we welcome everybody, we need to be a little more in memory that we welcome these people, that there are people involved. In fact, we just got the statistics for the past year of our online message. 2,120 people have, in the last year, played all the way through everything we've put up, whatever something that they have not just clicked on it, but played it all the way through. 2,100. We've done that 14,496 since 2010. Now, therefore, we welcome anyone who's picking it up in places like Malaysia, Nigeria, Guyana, Germany. Isn't that something? Singapore, Australia. Fascinating. The message is getting out. Do what we can do, get the message out. We do it with David. We do it online. Getting the message out is important. And that's a good intro to tonight, because we get the message out because there is a God. We can't take Jack's place, don't intend to. But for just a minute, I think we could all be Jack, right? There is a God. Okay. A few higher voices of women would be fine too in that. All right. Where did God come from? Very briefly, let's just walk through some ideas. One of the things that you do when you have those kinds of questions is you have to get in the proper arena. You have to get in a place where we can talk. And so I want to begin by noticing some very simple things. Number one, it seems to me that when you talk about where anything came from, there are only two possibilities. That's it. Now, if I'm wrong, I need to hear it, but there's only two. It's always been here, or it hasn't. That pretty well sums it up, seems to me. So anytime you want to say, where did so-and-so come from? Well, it's either always been here, therefore the question is moot, or it hasn't always been here, and there it came into being. That's it. Well, if it has always been here, then scientifically we have a problem. Because we know that all the experimental things that science does has always said that matter, physical things, are not eternal. They're just not. They don't last forever. They're not eternal. That's a very basic scientific principle. So to say that it has always been here when you talk about something, then we think about physical terms and we say, we know that can't be true because everything we see in physical terms hasn't always been here. But now we're talking about God. We're not talking about physical things. Oh, now see, that puts a whole new perspective. Now we're talking about a being that doesn't have the physical characteristics to be bound by the same scientific principle that it is not eternal. So it won't work for physical things, but it could work if we grant that there is a being out there that is not bound by these physical things and therefore did not come into being. It would work that way. Well, let's look at it the other way. Everything has, or it came into being. Now, there are two possibilities under that one. It came into being, okay? Well, maybe it came into being out of nothing. That's a possibility we have to think about. Okay, so everything that we can think about came into being out of nothing. There was a time when there was nothing. But then out of nothing came something. Well, again, the science community would tell us that just doesn't work. It is interesting, however. I read a quote from a man who at one time had been the chairman of one of the science departments at Harvard University, who said, there are only two possibilities for physical things: creation and spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation scientifically cannot be proven, and in science, it is an impossibility. Spontaneous generation, spontaneously out of nothing, something came to be. In science, we have to reject it. Can't be proven. It's wrong. And yet the alternative, creation, we don't want. So we're back to spontaneous generation. Now that's what the head of a department at Harvard said. He basically throws up his hands and says, I don't like creation, so I'm going to accept what we know can't be true. Wow. Now, the other possibility is that all that we're talking about came from something previous to it. That is, it grows out of, after its kind, something before it. Well, now that does work with science. It works with science because every time we see it, kind produces after its kind. That's what happens. So that makes sense. But that doesn't help us with God. Because if we accept that for God, then what kind produced God? I think the possibilities simply are these. There was a time when there was something from which everything came. But the something is not like that which came from it. Not bound by those characteristics. Therefore, yes, eternal. Yes, able to create. That's the only possibility that makes sense. Let's talk about that. Number two, let's talk about sense. Sense. How do we sense our world? Well, we live in a physical world, and therefore we sense our physical world with physical senses. Everybody knows this to be true. We can see it, we can hear it, we can smell it, we can taste it, we can touch it, and therefore we understand it, we sense it. And that's how we deal with things. But that's not all there is. In fact, I asked the question at camp this week. I ask it quite often. How many senses are there? And I got an answer that I've never gotten before. 8. I don't know where that comes from. I always get 5 because we just talked about those. And those who have been there when I've asked it more than once say, okay, 6. Because I think there are 6 senses, not 5. The 6th sense is reason. Reasoning is a sense because it takes the others and uses them to go where those have not gone. Sure, in a courtroom, facts from direct evidence can be submitted. I saw it. Here is what happened. But oftentimes you can't get that in a court. And therefore you line up all of the indirect evidence or circumstantial evidence that all points, when you put them all together, it all points in a way that makes sense through reasoning. And the reasoning is as powerful as the direct evidence. You can reason to something. Therefore, the concept of reason becomes very important in the discussion of where did God come from? What is reasonable? It is not reasonable that anything physical is eternal. It's just not. Therefore, if physical things exist, those physical things had to be or had to have a beginning somewhere. It doesn't make sense that it came from nothing, because again, that means we violate what we understand to be an accepted principle that nothing produced something. It is reasonable to say, here we are. We got here from a place that is not like us, a being not like us, a higher power, a greater being. We think of that being as God. I read today a scientist, in fact, Ken Ham, who built the Creation Museum and most recently built a replica of Noah's Ark that just opened. He called reason a gift from God. That's interesting. God gives us the power to reason. That makes sense to me. You know why? Because the prophet Isaiah in chapter 1 verse 18 called out to the people and said, "Come," from God, the word is, "Come, let us reason together." God expects us to be able to reason. That's not just true in the Old Testament prophets. It's also true in the New Covenant. Because Peter wrote to people and said in 1 Peter 3 and verse 15, "Sanctify the Lord God in your hearts and be ready always to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, yet with meekness and fear." God wants us to reason. It makes sense. That's reasonable. God is a reasonable answer. I was struck with that concept going through the Creation Museum when you think about the reasoning that is taking place there. But third, we need to talk about the key, which is biblical faith. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Hebrews 11:1. Mark Twain, that great biblical scholar, said, faith is what you know ain't so. Now, before you laugh at that, there are a whole lot of people that look at faith just that very way. It ain't so, but that's how it has to be. How do you know that you are in a good relationship with God? Well, I just know it. I just know it. How do you know God exists? Well, I just feel it right here. And yet, Peter wants us to have that reason for our hope. Here is the same statement from two different standpoints. Faith takes you so far, or reason, evidence takes you so far. Faith takes you the rest of the way. Now, that could mean this. Faith and evidence have nothing to do with each other. Some people understand faith that very way. In other words, I've assembled all the evidence. The evidence has run out. Now I go the rest of the way by faith. It's like having a chasm that you're wanting to cross. And the road goes out halfway and stops. But you've got to get the rest of the way. And so your evidence, the road, gets you halfway through the chasm. And when you run out of evidence, you just got to get over the best way you can. And that's faith. Faith and evidence have no relationship whatsoever to each other. None. In fact, faith takes the place. It says there is no evidence, but you take it anyway. Let's look at it, the same statement again. Evidence takes you so far, and faith takes you the rest of the way. You see, that can be true. And I would submit to you that it is. Because physical evidence takes you part of the way, but the evidence of faith takes you the rest of the way. But it is not as though it has left the evidence behind. Here's the idea. Faith, in fact, depends upon evidence. Without evidence, there is no faith. That's the biblical definition of faith. Because I have seen God operate faithfully all this time. That's the evidence. That's what I've seen. The part I haven't seen is God operating faithfully in the future, because we're not there yet. But the faith that I have is built upon the evidence that I have seen. Why did God write the Old Testament? Why? Romans 15:4. Whatever things were written before were written for our what? Learning. That we through faith, the patience of the Scriptures, might have hope. He gave us a whole lot of evidence in the Old Testament of who He is. And from that evidence, we then move forward. Does that mean we have less solid movement forward than we had in the past? Not at all. For it's the same God. When the Hebrew writer says Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, forever, he's talking about in his nature. Certainly he's operated in different ways, but his nature has never changed. And I know his nature is not going to change. So this I know. The faith that I have is actually built on the evidence. In fact, according to the way that text is written in Hebrews 11:1, faith becomes your evidence. And that's not the same as saying, oh, I know you have all these facts, but I got evidence. Wait a minute. That's not what we're talking about. Faith is a fact that becomes our evidence. You don't have to cower in the corner. Whenever you don't seem to have an evidence that you would like to have about God and who God is, you have faith already built on evidence. It's almost like there is a bridge that has scaffolding and you're riding on it and you can see that thing holding it up. And you can see the evidence is right there. Man, those are strong girders holding it up. It's doing well. But then, as you keep going, you can't see them. But you know they're there. You just can't see them. Maybe the fog came in, hiding it. You can't see it. But it's there. You see, you hadn't been to the future yet. But everything you're going to experience in the future is built on the evidence from the past. Now, where did God come from? Bible faith begins in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God. In other words, when the beginning began, God was already there. So yes, He is that eternal being, not bound by physical characteristics, who in fact has created after His kind, made in His image. God came from nowhere, for God has always been. The existence or the eternality of God is the only way to make sense of all that we see. Every time I go to the Creation Museum, took my parents this week, my mom, in fact, said it again. It takes a whole lot more, quote, faith to believe that all of this is without God than it takes to believe that all of this is with God. The truth of the matter is, those people out there that are struggling, they're trying to find an answer by getting rid of God. They're trying to find an answer in physical things, and they are frustrated. And they get turned on their heads constantly. A quick illustration. At the Creation Museum, there is a wall dedicated to something that made a point that Ken Ham was using in a debate he had with an unbeliever, an atheist. Part of that discussion had to do with the age of the earth. And the man he was debating said, "My friends and I have been to places where we have bored down into ice, pulled up deep cores of ice, and we counted the rings. And every ring shows every year. And every year we understand that with all these rings, there had to be millions of years to build it up. And in the debate, and there on that wall, if you've seen it and noticed it, 1942, 7 airplanes were trying to get home during the war. The storm turned them away. They landed in Greenland because they were out of fuel. I think they waited 7 days and were rescued. Left everything there. 1992, an expedition went to find the airplanes. 50 years later, they found them. 250 feet down inside the ice. You mean 250 feet of ice formed in 50 years? Those core drillings, just like the atheist said, counting them their way, said those planes have been there a few million years. What's he going to do with that? What evidence does for us with God is it points us in a direction. That's what it does. It points us. And when you stack up evidence after evidence after evidence after evidence, you can't reasonably get anywhere else to answer every other question of life without the one that says there is a God and He has always been. His origin is not a discussion, for origin is a discussion of things physical, not things spiritual. And that is a reasonable argument. That question, of course, was turned in the one question thing. We could spend a long, long time discussing those concepts in great depth. But if you just take one thing with you, it is reasonable that there is a God. It is unreasonable that there is no God. I hope that gives you some fuel to fuel your faith and maybe send you on a journey to make it even deeper in your research. If there is a God, and He has communicated with us as He would, then He wants to have a relationship with you. And He proved that by sending Jesus. And that relationship is possible. Tonight, if you don't have a relationship with God through His Son, let's talk about it. Let's visit about it. Let's think about it. But if you're ready to have that relationship now, we can baptize you into Jesus Christ. We can pray to restore that relationship if once you had it and strayed tonight while we stand and sing together.